welcome. Um, Again, since I've got a couple of you that still have the audio on, I just want to make sure when you see the screen, are you seeing my full screen? It says the Cold War, and you don't see any
Yeah,
other boxes on there, right? Nothing else?
right.
Excellent. Good. So, we're going to jump the start just a touch here. I show that it's almost 6:30. Welcome, everybody. And we are moving in to the next section. Remember, the whole concept of this program has been that, uh, you know, my contention is that it was the conflicts of the 20th century that actually drove the 20th century. And those conflicts did not end with World War II. And even though, we did not have the worldwide massive conflagrations that we would end up with, with World War I and World War II, the Cold War actually still was an engagement. And while it was never intended to be a hot war, it did drive a lot of things. So that's what I'm going to be trying to push. I see Patricia's joined us. Thank you. Nice to see you, Ms. Simmons. And so, with that, you know, one of the contentions again that while we always start with a brief review, my goal today is to make sure we're kind of drawing this in. Now, we started with the overview in section one that looked at how it all got started. And I said it was a competition, not a shooting war, a competition. Even though we called it a Cold War, it really wasn't supposed to be about actual conflict, but it was a competition between the two remaining superpowers, the two that could have something going. And then we saw how the one attained, if not a nuclear parity, at least the ability to do damage with that. But we're last time then, instead of looking globally, we were looking at the impact that McCarthyism had. And what we were really looking at with that was not at the national level, even, it was more at the personal level. How did that affect us? How did that affect people in the United States? This time we're going to be seeing how that now carries on. We talked a little bit about the actual hot war of Korea starting last time. So as we get into that quickly, I'm just going to ask anybody, is there anything that you learned last week? We were talking about what McCarthyism was. And of course, that was not, I said, it was not debating the issues, it was dodging the issues and attack the person that brought those issues. And in fact, Roy Cohen would say that what Joe McCarthy taught him was if anybody, you know, aims something at you, questions you, pushes back against what you're offering, hit them with a wrecking ball, destroy their concentration, their position, make it so that the person is no longer that all the watchers are not waiting to hear the answer to that. And the perfect example of that, of course, um, you know, we saw that Margaret Chase Smith in Maine had actually rose to challenge McCarthy, and they'd been friends in the Senate. She had tried to challenge the direction he was taking in 1950 and said, I do not want to see the Republican Party dragged down to this level. And she named the smear tactics and the rest of it. And of course, instead of challenging that that's what he was doing, he turned around and said, and now we've heard from Maggie from Moscow. And she'd gotten 6 Republican senators to sign on with her, and of course, Joe McCarthy was a Republican. She'd gotten 6 to sign on with her, and he dubbed them Maggie from Moscow and her 6 dumb dwarves. And with that, of course, what we saw with him, he was great at the name tags, he was great at invectives. And what we would see over the years is that he would, you know, be able to constantly bully people into his points. We also saw last time what I said were many other hinge events where things change afterwards. The Russians getting the bomb in 1949 really put people into a disarray. They'd felt they were so far behind us. How could this group that's almost primitive have possibly caught up with us so quickly? Then almost immediately thereafter, China would fall, and then in the process, and by when I say China falls, what I mean is the nationalist forces finally are exiled from the mainland. They head to Formosa, later known as Taiwan, to be able to survive. And of course, the United States says, "Well, we'll protect you there. Our umbrella will cast over you." But um, in that process, what had happened was the Democrats would lose control of the Senate. And what that would mean, of course, is they would have a tremendous change in their fortunes and their outlook. They had been drummed out of all of that. And, then, of course, it's revealed that the way that the Russians got the bomb is there were communist spies within the program. And remember, Alger Hiss, who um, had been accused of being a communist spy, who had actually fought back on that. Alger Hiss, who had he'd fought back by saying, "No, I'm, that's slander," and then he is brought up on perjury charges. He had had a deadlock, in late 49 at uh, the previous court hearing. But with all of these things happening, and now we know there's actual proof that there are spies, Alger Hiss is convicted of perjury. They couldn't convict him on spying because it was past the statute of limitations. And a week or two after that, Joe McCarthy gives his famous "I have in my hand a list of 205 State Department employees who are actually still getting their instructions from Moscow and, delivering the information back to Moscow from them." So all of these items are churning together. And that, of course, is when McCarthy came up. We had mentioned this. What was McCarthy? I had said, what is the impact of McCarthyism on Americans? And that impact of McCarthyism, as I said, really changed a lot of our future. The perfect example is I said that Margaret Chase Smith in 1950 could only get six other people, six Republicans, to go along. And in fact, six of anybody to go along. That's six out of 96. One would suspect it if it had been a secret ballot to try to censor McCarthy at that early time, the outcome would have been much, much different. And then I'd mentioned that Truman instituting the loyalty oaths um, was a major event that changed things for Americans. And I want to make sure that I address that. Why did he do it? Why did he bring forward loyalty oaths? He wanted to make sure he would not be outflanked on the right. We see that all the time. And in fact, we could honor that in some ways. We could say, well, that's you know, meeting in the middle. This is what the right wing wants. We can see there might be a reason for that. People should be loyal if they're going to work for the American government. And remember, that's the only people the loyalty oaths actually applied to: people in federal jobs. But it becomes the template for all state and local jobs. And all of a sudden now you have actual cases where a janitor would lose their job because it is believed he had once belonged to the Communist Party. Because remember, that's the difference. At the national level, you could technically be have been in my college years. I was a wild and crazy youth, and of course it was the Great Depression. Yes, I belonged to the Communist Party, but I see how terrible they are today. The difference being, and remember, just so you know, that letter saying he had 205 names, part of that is an outgrowth of something exactly like that. The State Department had gone through and they had cleared people who had been accused of being former communists, because they said, we have checked, they are clearly not communists today. And there were 200 and some that there was some contention on. They had been left in their position because they said, we have checked them and cleared them. That's where that number of 200 and something comes in. But of course, McCarthy had found that the key was dominating the news cycle. Now, remember, I said toward the end of the show last time that Joe McCarthy would be discredited. Joe McCarthy taking on the Army, would finally have stepped on enough toes. And remember, Ike's point had been all along, I really can't take it. I'm not going to get down in the gutter with him. Give him enough rope and he'll hang himself. And technically, that is what happens in the Army McCarthy hearings. They are broadcast on TV and they become notorious because people now are exposed all day to watching this guy bully people, and that's really what it is, just bullying them. And remember, it's not just about communism. One of the other things is, when you're being investigated, if they had found that there were other issues, if you were Jewish, that's a red flag for some people, not for the departments they're working in, but others. Oh, we have to worry about those people. Um, or if you had a different sexual orientation. And many of the people that McCarthy would end up bullying, that would be the issue. Because according to the FBI, and according to J. Edgar Hoover, if you have an odd sexual preference, that makes you liable. It makes it much easier that you would betray your country rather than be outed. That's really what they were saying. And thus, while most of the hearings and most of the video we have will have him saying the famous line, are you now or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party? And there are some, though, that are you now or have you ever been a member of a perverted class of people with odd sexual preferences or anything like that. I mean, he would make it as nasty as possible. And that, of course, is why so many of them would end up pleading the fifth rather than testify. And once you plead the fifth, then the questions would just become, as I said, the bullying questions. So in 1949, is that when you were still you were a member of the State Department? Were you still at that point delivering all your information to the Communist Party in Russia? And and of course they can't say anything. They can just say, I plead the fifth. So we have it in our history, and people will tell you, oh, it was Ed Murrow, the premier journalist of his time, that actually took down Joe McCarthy, that he took him on. First of all, Ed Murrow would say horse feathers to that, because of course Ed Murrow did the same thing that Ike did. He had said, he's too powerful, we can't take him on at this point. And finally, in 1954, he saw a clear case. But remember what Ed Murrow did when he played that show. All he did was take clip after clip after clip of Joe McCarthy talking. And he did not cut them to make him look bad. Of course, Joe McCarthy was making himself look bad if you just looked at anything he did. but of course he was keeping it at a distance. McCarthy comes on, See It Now, and you know does the same thing he always does. He attacks Murrow. Oh, he's a member of this anti-American organization. No, I was not. Oh, he was under the tutelage of this guy. Well, I have a signed book from that guy, but at that time he was not trying to overthrow the American government, nor had he ever been. I attended a seminar. So with all those things, we need to realize um, McCarthy had a habit all his life. If you go back and read his life, he would be diligent. He would work hard on certain things. He would work hard just until he hit success. And then he would go over to excess. And with excess, he would end up squandering everything and every advantage. The difference being when he got into playing the media, he was in his element. And that's one of the problems because even after Murrow, even after the Army McCarthy hearings. Suddenly, at the end of the Army McCarthy hearings, here it's always been the Gallup polls have always said he's ridden at 50% where people love him and 33% who hate him. And in fact, in the early 1950s, Gallup would would write an interesting opinion piece saying, we keep taking these polls about Joe McCarthy, and it's really interesting. And this is what he wrote. I'm not making this up. I can't remember if he said, if it had come out that Joe McCarthy had killed 5 or 6 children, I don't think it would matter to his followers. Does that sound familiar? Is that amazing? You know, because they loved him. And here's the point I'm trying to make. One, at the end of the Army McCarthy hearings, those numbers flipped finally. There were enough people that had been exposed and saw just how, lackadaisical but ugly he was being and unfair he was being in these hearings, and how he really had no point. The hearings constantly would say, well, you're saying you have this list of these people in the Army. So, or at this defense plant or anything else, have you shared those with, my gosh, get those down to the FBI so they can be taken care of? Well, we've done that. Well, if you've done that, then why are we here? He was finally outplayed in his own game. But my point is that those numbers flipped. Now suddenly 50% hate him and only 33% love him. Here's another point. That 33% didn't care. Even after he is censored by the Senate, even after he is stripped of all power, even after, and realize his alcoholism had continued to grow and give him problems. Even after all of that, that 30% did not care. They stayed 33%. They stayed loyal and believed, realize that, these things would continue. And here's what I want you to think about. And I'm going to send you these links in the newsletter so that you can look at them. I just want you to think about, we credit and we laud Ed Murrow, this great newsman, for taking him on and making it work. But here's what I want you to think about. About a year, not even that, after Murrow had taken on Eugene McCarthy, Bill Palin, who the head of CBS, CBS, the company, who was his friend, comes to him and says, oh, we're going to have to do something different about your news. Your Alcoa, who has been your longtime sponsor, they've decided that this just isn't working for them anymore. They don't really want to sponsor your program. They want entertainment. People want entertainment from TV. So we'll do this, I believe, or we'll do this. And of course, Murrow is just shocked, and of course that all of a sudden, these people who believe that television should be a citizenship machine, something that's putting out valuable information, they're seeing that everybody else is backing away from it. They just want entertainment. They just want fun. My point being, nobody ever draws or connects the line, but because no one ever says it, but he lost that sponsor and did not get him back. I think Ed Murrow paid a major price for taking him on. And even though he damaged him, and even though McCarthy is on his way out, McCarthy and his followers, I feel, damaged Ed Murrow and took him down with them too. And we never talk about that. And that's the other thing I want you to think about. Much is made of the fall of McCarthy and how, oh, the fever breaks and we're all there. My point is, he does fall, he's censored, but not until after 55, after he damages his own party, treads on the president's toes by attacking the army. But even after all that, completely discredited, completely broken, seen by all his colleagues at the Senate level as a charlatan, I think and a liar. He only got like one vote. He gave the 67 votes to strip him of his powers, to censor him, but lots of people dodged. One of those people that dodged was a friend of his, another Irish American, some guy named Jack Kennedy, who couldn't show up for the vote. He was in the hospital for a back operation. Remember, Bobby Kennedy was a good friend. McCarthy hung out at the Kennedys. He actually tried to date one of the sisters. Here's the big thing. While the mainstream media is celebrating, Morrow and celebrating this fall, William F. Buckley is writing McCarthy and His Enemies as a book and making his name. And, he's founding the National Review. Robert Welch is founding the John Birch Society, now convinced that Ike too must be part of that worldwide conspiracy that McCarthy has hinted at, that Ike is a willing agent of the communists, all because of his treatment of McCarthy. Now remember, back then we had 3 television stations. It was the Army McCarthy hearings that made ABC. They put them on live, put them on all day, and that's what got people watching. But those 3 television stations, as I said, they believed it's a citizenship machine. Television was important, powerful, and it was regulated and licensed. Those 3 TV stations, networks, acted as cultural and political gatekeepers. And McCarthy, still, they could all tell the world, and did, that, John Birch Society guys, the Birchers are just part of that fringe element. They're part of the crazy guys on the side. But McCarthy's third stayed loyal through all this and would continue to stay loyal. And that's something we need to think about, because, of course, today those gatekeepers are long gone. Now it's anything goes, and if it gets us ratings, we don't care. So, with all of that, and remember, what was the short-term result of China falling to communism? That short-term result was that the Democrats paid a heavy, heavy price for Truman saying, all of the money is going into Chiang Kai-shek's pocket. It wouldn't matter how much money. We don't even care that we'd already given them something like $3 billion, and they couldn't handle this because they were siphoning off all the money. And that long-term result is those who paid that price would do just about anything to avoid going through that again. And we will see the results of that in Vietnam. Now, we're going through Ike, JFK, LBJ today and beyond if we can. And the key thing is, I always ask some framing questions. What impact does the Cold War events of the 1950s and 60s have on us today, 70s? Why? That's ancient history. That can't have any impact today, can it? And always remember, what do we know now versus what we knew then? And that's a big thing. And I want to make sure. I realized last week I kept using revisionist history. And of course, in a lot of places, revisionist means suspect. Revisionist means, oh, those guys who want to change what history was. No, I don't mean it that way. You could almost say scholarly history, people who have looked at this and say, well, let's weigh all of it. And of course, that's what I'm trying to do here, is bring all of it. So let's remember, I try to reference things that we know now that we didn't know then. And remember, Truman and all the rest of these guys, Ike, Kennedy, LBJ, they are all going to have to guess. They don't get this choice. And remember, Truman had guessed right. It was the USSR. Now, North Korea had come to Stalin to say, we want to attack the South. We want to do this. Remember, Stalin, of course, had, and we need to remember that Stalin really saw himself more as a czar. And that's something else we didn't see. Oh, no, no, we don't have emperors anymore. We don't have, anointed leaders. No, no, we're all part of the great body of the people. And no, Stalin was up there and knew it and was doing terrible things. What we know now is Stalin actually did do a lot to see the promotion of North Korea attacking South Korea. We know that now. What we're also going to see are these other items, and we're going to see some things about stuff about our own government that we didn't know, our actions in Iran, our actions in Guatemala, Haiti and Vietnam, and things like that. Those are things we didn't know. Now, remember, as we discussed, as the Republicans are taking over with their great victory in 1952, they are against what Truman has done. Truman, saying, "Oh, we're here to contain the USSR, and appeasement's not an option, and U.S. isolationism is no longer possible." Well, all right, the Republicans would go along with a certain amount of that. Remember, the statement that was always made back then is politics stops at the edge of the shore. So in other words, as we go outside the country, we go together as partners. But the reality is the Republicans had wanted rollback, not containment. They want to push the Soviets out. That's what they're preaching. That's what they ran on to win in 46 and again in 52. So big things. We talked about Korea invading. And the point being that Ike had made a promise that if he were elected, remember, I talked about what had happened in Korea and the stalemate that resulted, a little less than a year afterwards, when we pulled everything back together. I talked about, some of the pieces of that. Ike has said, I will go to Korea and we will end this war. Now, remember, I'd mentioned this before, and it's important to remember. Another thing that Truman had done was, remember, he took nuclear weapons out of the hands of the military after what was seen to have happened at Hiroshima. It would take an executive order. It would take the president to decide nuclear weapons could be utilized. And remember when MacArthur got bounced back because he had said, "Oh, the Chinese will never attack," and when they started attacking and they're rolling back all the troops well past the 38th parallel, all the coming back the other way, he starts screaming, he wants a blue cobalt haze laid across Manchuria. And Truman said no. And of course, all this is what's going to lead to MacArthur being sacked. But Ike's priorities, he says, it's ending the war in Korea. I shall go to Korea, and he does. And he visits a month after the election. He's president-elect. He is not president yet. And by July, almost August, he will get that armistice. Remember, we are still at war with North Korea. We have never ended that war. So he moves from general, to the White House. And of course, he does a great job. People love him, especially after oh my gosh, Truman's been attacked for the 3 C's: crime, corruption, and commies. This is tremendous to have him in charge. But even so, we need to realize that Korea transformed the entire Cold War. The things we now and going forward will consider the Cold War hadn't really been there before this. Cold War from now on will have a high degree of tension because, of course, both sides have nuclear weapons. Both sides can annihilate the other and the human race with it. We will have an arms race because remember what I'd said when the Russians actually got the atomic weapons, and shortly thereafter, the Chinese will as well. Truman's answer was build more bombs. And we will have, remember, I said all of this was really a competition for those new third world countries, the non-aligned countries. We wanted them, they wanted them. It's all about our prestige. It's all about how we look. The Cold War after Korea, it's a competition and conflict in the third world. And we're going to see that because really, and now, as we get 10 years after World War II, what we start to see is a lot of these conflicts are starting to boil over. You know, remember, we saw originally all of these things, we saw them through the lens of the Cold War. We saw them through the lens of the competition, in which we saw communism and we would say, oh, they're being run from Moscow. Now, what we're going to start seeing going forward is people who are unhappy with the situation after 10 years after the end of World War II are now starting to act up and push back against their governments in those third world places. In all the other places, things have not changed in the least. This is a timeline, and I'm going to just call out a few of these items. Here we see that Ike is elected president. A big one that's huge. There's the Russians getting the A bomb. But a big one we need to realize here was McCarthy getting, coming along. But here's a big one that was not foreseen. Stalin dies. What's that mean? How is that going to change the Cold War? What in the world is going to come out of that? And this is that part where we suddenly start to find out about things years later that we didn't know that could change our minds. We see this one that says Iranian coup. We see this one that says Guatemalan coup. We see French in Vietnam. And this one, I've mentioned Stalin dies. Remember, Stalin had been doing pogroms against his own people, wiping out anybody that might be moving on him. Remember, as I said, he consolidated the power and would wipe out people beneath him. People that had been heroes of World War II suddenly are gone, disappeared. We don't know where they went. And remember, again, I keep talking about how we have to guess. One of those big ones here, what we didn't know for years, is Khrushchev has been working to gain power. And while he looks like a backwoods bumpkin, everything we saw as the backwards Russians, um, he's a very sharp player of the game. And he builds up his power and then gets to the point where he says what everybody would like to say about Stalin a year or so after his Stalin's death, and actually comes out in a speech in front of everybody criticizing Stalin and lives to tell about it, thus demonstrating that he has people that are following him, watching over him, protecting him, and he is now going to become the next leader of the Soviet Union. Now, remember, I said that we're seeing lots of these third world countries starting to try to flex their muscles. That's the Iranian coup. That's Nasser taking power in Egypt against the concept of the Israelis, who now have a chunk of the Middle East. The Poland unrest, the battles in Suez, all of those things are important. We're going to see this other one as well, the Sino-Soviet split. We'll talk about that in a little bit. These are all features of the 50s that we didn't understand. Iran in 1953 essentially says we've had it with the Shah, and they've got a popular prime minister, and they decide they are going to they are going to have a revolution and displace the Shah. Now, of course, the problem with that is the Shah has guaranteed oil rights to Britain. And Britain, of course, wants that oil. Britain, of course, is still, suffering all the after effects of World War II. And the problem is Truman says, that's not our world. It's not our part. We do want to make sure they don't fall to the Russians. But, and that had been an issue. They're kind of that buffer zone between Russia, or excuse me, the Soviet Union and and the Middle East. So, but Truman wasn't interested. So with the British losing control, the popular government turns around and nationalizes all the oil fields. That's a big deal. That's going to have an impact. But the U.S. says, "Nah, we're not interested. That's not our part of the world. We're already engaged in Europe. That's enough." But when Ike gets elected and takes over, he says, "Yeah, we can help you with that." Because remember, Ike has turned around and decided, I don't want any hot wars. I don't want any Koreas, but I don't remember the Republicans want rollback. We will keep we'll keep these guys off balance. And if we can do it on the cheap, i.e., not with troops, not with massive warfare, but with clandestine methods, sure, I'll sign off on that, says Ike. And he does. The government's overthrown. The Shah is returned to power. Now, of course, he'll be assassinated a little bit later after that. But, with that, we see behind the scenes some things we didn't realize we had a part in. That was the beginning, and it really becomes very much the method of the CIA. We don't have a place in those areas, but the British do, because they're all former areas of interest where they either had colonies or they had business interests. So, the CIA finds it very easy to utilize the space that the British have already carved out in these places. So we do a lot of joint uh, operations with them. And this suits Ike and suits, his view of the world just fine. We see Khrushchev taking control. And during that time he's taking control, we see a guy who seems pretty powerful. We see a guy who seems very strong, but we also see somebody that's not smooth. So we're not sure what's happening with that. But at the same time, by 56, you know, Hungary says, we have had it with the Soviet Union trying to tell us what to do. The people rise up. Now, remember, we've been broadcasting Voice of America there now for almost 10 years. We've been, embrace democracy, be part of that, throw off those chains. And they do. They rise up and they face down. They're pulling down the statues and they're saying, we are going to be free. And of course, the Republican Party comes to Ike and says, "Here we go. We're going in. We're rolling them back." And Ike's like, "We can't sustain. We can't send anybody. We can't send the 101st Airborne in there. There's nothing that be surrounded. You're crazy." And of course, what we see, and this becomes a policy, and we will learn in the Cold War, all of these places depend on who's in charge. As we will see, Khrushchev will send in the tanks. As we will see in Czechoslovakia, the Soviets will send in the tanks. As we will see in Poland, they will send in the tanks. The Cold War, or excuse me, the Russia does not fall until you finally get a leader who says, "I don't want to do that. We can't do that." But remember, even at that same time in the 1989, while all of these places are throwing off the Soviet Union, when the same thing starts to happen in China, what's the difference? They're not ready to back off, and they do send in the tanks, don't they? Tiananmen Square and all the things that happen there. This is kind of a black eye with the Hungarian Revolution. It will take 2 to 3 weeks, but they will be expunged. The leaders will be put down, and the Soviets will take control. Now, I'd mentioned Sputnik and what a big difference it made. You have to realize made a huge difference because of two things, and those are things that are very important to us today. First of all, it kicks off the space age. Remember, America had been saying, all of her scientists, yeah, you can't get anything larger than a bowling ball into orbit. It just takes too much thrust, too much power, because of course you have to throw yourself into that orbit. And, they knew exactly how much power it took, and they just said it couldn't happen. And then all of a sudden they're starting to hear this beep, beep, beep. And as you see here, it can be traced both by radio and visually. And it's a feat that, as we see here in Life magazine, that shook the earth. And that's a big thing. And it shaped my life because, of course, science, technology, all of those things became super important. And money was put toward it for training. And that's the direction I originally started out as. That's where I went in college. That was what I was interested in. Have slide rule will travel. That was, you know. So it is another one of those hinge events because also we feel our prestige is now damaged. These are backward peasants. How in the world could they have outpaced us? That's huge. At the same time, what we don't realize is behind the scenes, there are tensions between China and Russia because one of the things that China notices, they're sending in those tanks to Hungary. They are putting down people in Poland. They are saying, no, it's our way and it's the only way, meaning our way. We are the true owners of communism. Mao Tse-tung says, no, we are. And in actuality, he will stage some border events. He will send troops and push back against their shared border just to show the Russians, it's now believed, just to show the Russians, no, don't send your tanks here. We won't put up with it. We will not go along with it. We already fought a 10-year war. We will continue to do so, and you will not make it. But we, of course, don't really understand any of that because anybody in the foreign State Department, I should say, in Foreign Service, in the State Department, that was an Asian expert basically got purged during the McCarthy years. We did not have those experts, we did not have that years of expertise left to even bring us this concept. It would be years before we realized it. Now, of course, we will start to pick up on it. And one of the other things is, of course, China is also being more aggressive toward Formosa, where Chiang Kai shek and the rest of the nationalists had fled, now known as Taiwan. And what they would do is they started shelling the small islands just to make it clear to them we do have the power and the technology to do this. What they didn't have was enough boats. There is no way in heck they could get across the strait at that time. 75 years later, that's a totally different story, isn't it? But that will be a huge thing. And of course, Ike stands tall and says, no, we will defend Taiwan. You step against them, we will defend them. We should have gathered something was up because Khrushchev comes to Iowa. There's an Iowa farmer. He's a little more than that. Who sees that Khrushchev is saying we're going to, because the Russians and the Soviets were huge into these programs. We're going to have a 5-year program and we're going to go from this amount of production to this amount of production. And Garth Roswell in Iowa, who has the feed, the hybrid concept, and he would actually tell you that he had taught Wallace everything the Wallace family knew. for all of that, but with Pioneer corn. But the the point being that he writes Khrushchev and says, well, you need to come over here because what you're talking about, what you've got, you're not going to cut it unless you learn to do it the right way. And we can do that. We can sell you the tractors. We can sell you the right, uh, corn seeds. We can do this. And what will happen is Khrushchev takes him up on it. Of course, the State Department is freaking out because just the idea of reaching out to a communist, my gosh, are you a communist? And he's like, I'm no communist, you idiot. I'm a businessman. And he invites Khrushchev, and Khrushchev agrees and comes over. And what we actually are starting to find out is that Khrushchev definitely plays the media just as well as everybody else in this time period, better than some. He may look like a country bumpkin, but he actually pulls it off. Now, the only problem is he's very angry because he had one thing he wanted to do when he got to America. Anybody know what that was? He wanted to go to Disneyland. And it's 1959, and Disneyland looking at these crowds that this guy is attracting out in the middle of nowhere. And of course, he will go to, I believe it's Ames. He will go and see many, some parts here in Iowa, and come to see all this. But um, you know, he's really angry because Disneyland says, well, we couldn't guarantee his safety. We don't even want to take that chance. And by the way, if you go back and look at a lot of these pictures in Iowa at the Garth farm, you're going to see a guy hanging around there that everybody thought was with somebody else. And there is some question, he was there to see a real live communist, and there is some question later if he was really our version of a country bumpkin. But there is some question if, wow, if he had decided he was there to kill Khrushchev, he was close enough to do it. And that's Disney's point. They don't want anything to happen on their property. And he gets, Khrushchev gets so angry. What? You have rocket launching pads hidden there? What is it? But by the time he gets together with Ike, it's all smiles for the camera and life's great. They agree they're going to have a peace summit in 1960. This works for Khrushchev. It works for Ike. Ike has this idea that he wants peace. Now, Ike has been proposing ideas that, what, we should have a great eye in the sky. I'll allow you to fly over America. We'll fly over your countries. We'll know there's nothing there, right? We'd know if you were, mobilizing for war. We'd be able to do this. And of course, the Russians go, "Niet, you can't do that. We're not giving that up." And it's questionable whether Americans would have put up with it too. But if I could ask, they probably would have. The point is, though, we are at a thaw in East West relations because, of course, it does work for Khrushchev to move a little closer to the West since he's now got some problems back on the other side because the Chinese are also saying, that area up there in the Kursk area and things like that, really, that should be ours, north of North Korea. So that gets starting to get a little worrisome. But, you've got this big peace summit coming up. And Ike had long ago authorized these high level flyovers of U-2s to see what's going on. And it's one of the reasons why he knows this new guy running for president named Kennedy, who's saying that there's a missile gap. Phooey, there's not even anything close to it. We know what they got, and there's nothing there. But right on the eve of this big summit, on May Day of all things, where all the eyes in Russia are on Moscow, in the Soviet Union are on Moscow. They note yet another one of these spy planes. Now, Ike has been told it flies so high, they have nothing that can reach it. And besides, it doesn't really matter because it's 60,000 feet. There's no way in heck the pilot would survive. And even if he did, we've given them, poison to kill themselves so that there's nothing there and we can deny everything. And so Ike had approved the idea of these and they continued. Khrushchev collects all this stuff, goes on TV showing all the fuselage and everything else, saying, hey, we're spying on us. We have been wronged. And this is where everything goes bad because had, in Khrushchev's mind, and again, this is what we know afterwards, in Khrushchev's mind, if I could come and said, my underlings did that, I didn't know anything about it, I'm sorry. Yeah, probably would have said, okay, I get that. Or if he'd said, bad choice on my part, you know, but Ike goes on TV and says it's a weather balloon that was off. We don't spy on him. There's no, and Khrushchev is just outraged, and then brings out his secret weapon because, of course, the pilot had survived and been captured. The thaw is passed, and the Soviet Union plays it for everything they can in the public opinion, and of course, they've shot down the big spy plane. You know, um, they're armed with both nukes and missiles. And that's the other issue of that Sputnik, right? Is the fact that now we have ballistic missiles that can reach a great distance. And the bigger difference is close no longer just counts in horseshoes and hand grenades, it also counts in nukes. You don't have to be perfect. All you got to do is get close to Sac Air Force Base when you drop that ballistic missile. And that was a big issue to people because, of course, we had the airplanes that could fly in. We had the forward base all surrounding all of Russia, all of the Soviet Union. Now, with the missiles, it's a bigger story. But these are all the things at the top level. Throughout the 1950s, we are seeing covert actions that are disrupting um, actions by people that said we don't want to have a ruler anymore. We want our duly elected prime minister. Oh no, the CIA will back taking away that and putting a ruler back in place because it was good business. And we see it in Guatemala, we see it in Africa, we see it over and over again. We, of course, deny having anything to do with it. But here at the end of the 1960s, there could be a little alarm bell ringing. Well, that's Ike denying that we had any spies in the sky. And now he's had to admit that we do. This could be a bad thing. But remember, this Cold War wasn't just at the top. We had daily air raid sirens to remind us what to do. And we're told over and over again about how terrible communists are. And they're out there to get us. They have spies on the ground here. And we've seen with McCarthy, even though he's been discredited, we know the commies are still out there. In fact, maybe they helped strike him down, according to some of them. Remember our bestsellers through the 1950s, the Mike Hammer books, which, if in case you hadn't read it, remember Mike's best friend is murdered. They're both cops, as I recall. It's been a long time. And Mike, is determined to find out who killed him and realizes it was a commie, that his buddy had uncovered a commie cell. Now, throughout the book, he's getting closer and closer. And of course, there's a lot of graphic violence and there's a lot of trouble. And of course, he also is getting closer and closer to his best friend's widow. And of course, by the end of the story, it turns out that the best friend's widow is a secret communist agent. And of course, Mike's fallen in love with her. But as he says in the title, my gun is quick, or I the jury, or any of the rest of these. By the end of the 1950s, these Cold War potboilers are the 9 out of the 10 best-selling books in America. This has filtered down to our level. On that list, the only one that's not written by Mickey Spillane for those 10 bestsellers is the Bible. And it's not number one. Spillane has number one sewn up. The point being, when they say that to Spillane, he says, well, I can see it. both books are about just like mine. They got a lot of vengeance, they got a lot of violence, they got a lot of anger, they got a lot of righteousness and justice in them. They also both have a lot of sex in them, right? So, um, this also is showing us that we have the paperback books coming along, which is also making a big deal. But remember what I said, you know, what this really is just that sign that, we at the lower level are tied up in this too, whether it's preparing for that nuclear attack, preparing for the spies to come and get us, all of these things, that's part and parcel of our day. And the difference being where maybe at the top, they're dealing with it, on a global perspective. Those of us down here, we're part of those true believers, aren't we? We really think it's my country. Remember, we've forced a change in the Pledge of Allegiance because we know those commies are godless. Well, we'll make it really uncomfortable for them now when they fake their Pledge of Allegiance. They've got to say under God, right? Because in 53 or so, we changed that. Well, as I said, there's lots of stuff going on. Cuba has finally thrown off the bad Batista group. By 59, this bearded rebel who's been in the hills for 7 years and built a bigger and bigger group of people, who are tired of working on these sugarcane farms for nothing while the plantation owners, hacienda owners, whatever you want to call them, are getting richer and richer and bigger. And of course, Havana and Guantanamo, especially Havana, that's where the American businessmen are, and that's where America is offshored a lot of its things that they've said aren't good for America, like casinos, like prostitution and things like that. So lots of big things going on. Ike, on the other hand, is certain this new Castro guy can be controlled. Life's no problem. He might be right. He could be controlled, but not by Ike. It turns out he's wrong. And immediately we start planning yet another one of those coups against a popular uprising because we're convinced that it had to have, the flames had to have been fanned by the communists. Big deal, right? you know, and we see all of these things coming together. Now, Ike's credibility is in shreds between that and the U2 incident. His last tour of the world, which was going to be all about peace, is going down in flames. His plans for a summit and all that gets canceled. And thus you've got the jockeying for who's going to take his place. And one of those guys is the guy that had become his second in command, although he really wasn't. He was his vice president, but nowhere to be seen on any decisions or any other things. Ike really had never liked Dick Nixon. Um, and, with the concept of peace in the deep freeze, the Cold War has returned at full force. We have the kitchen debate where Nixon and Khrushchev square off, it'd be at the equivalent of the Sioux City Home Show. We've brought all these goods and everything over to Moscow to show them how great things are. And it's interesting because we have video of this and they're really peaceful, but the minute you turn the cameras on them, you get stuff like this, where you've got each of them gesticulating and pointing and acting up for the cameras. And that's very much what it is. Whereas the video comes off like, oh, shucks, when you go look at it. The other guy, on the other hand, has what we would later call rock star qualities. He can pull a crowd together. And again, he's about the same age as Nixon. He's part of that class that came out of World War II that went into public service and has moved up. Both of them used to be friends, sharing had an office across from each other. Heck, Joe Kennedy, Jack's father, was giving Nixon campaign contributions when he was running for the Senate. So hey, it's one of those things. But Kennedy is a Democrat, but he's a cold warrior, and it's going to be Kennedy and Nixon who will square off. And all of the issues for the Cold War are on display in one of the amazing uses of this new concept of television, where they meet in Chicago for this incredible televised debate to decide, to try to inform viewers, what a concept, right? Inform viewers of where they stand on the different items. And it's going to be, I believe, foreign affairs will be the first of four. And of course, it's believed that this should be Nixon's area. And you will see the two of them square off and, talk at each other, but do a great job of talking to the crowd. Now, compared to today's debates, it was a fantastic performance of knowledge from each of these guys. And this is one of the things. Nixon had just come out of the hospital. He wasn't feeling well. He's sweating profusely. His makeup's not that good. And it is said that if you listened to the radio and heard it, you thought Nixon had the edge. But if you watched it on TV, boy, you really liked that Jack Kennedy guy. And thus we start to see that shift in power on the media side as well. Remember, though, we have the ability to go back and focus in on these things. Remember, there's lots of other things happening. And one of those things that keeps happening is there's these guys going around saying, black people are not getting a fair deal in America. And really you ought to do something about that. And instead, in those places where that's happening, they will arrest and throw these people into prison, workforces, and things like that. Why does that matter in the Cold War? Two reasons. One, J. Edgar Hoover will tell, uh, Ike will tell whoever is president, behind all of these, there is a communist influence. There are those outside agitators. We used to hear that all the time, right? Now, of course, that that is another example of, if you measure everything by the Cold War and what it means to that competition, suddenly, that becomes the primary point. And one of the things about this is, of course, the rest of the world, those third world countries, most of those people don't necessarily look like us. They might look a little bit more like the people being thrown in prison here. And thus, it's also, and we'll hear this throughout the Kennedy years, this is an embarrassment. We have to fix this. This should not be this way. He is very mindful of how it looks to the rest of the world. But he's got to win the presidency first, which he does in a razor thin squeaker. And remember, this is where he actually shows some of his skills. During his transition, he impresses people so much by his diligence that those Gallup polls, if you ask, well, which one did you vote for? If you follow the Gallup polls, you'd believe he won by 70% because that's what they tell the pollsters. No, 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 I voted for him. So looking back, we've hit the 60s. Was the 50s a quiet, peaceful time that we were always told, or was it one of turmoil? Did Ike face Cold War issues? Absolutely. And what does it matter that the US backed dictators over popular elections, over popular leaders who helped those dictators either hold on to power or get back into power? What kind of a future might that roll out? That's one of those things that we have to look at. And, that's one of those things that's going to look differently to us. When Ike was in, when Ike went out, we all looked at him as a hero. He was the great hero who was president, super popular. Probably if he hadn't been limited to the two terms, if he had wanted to run again, he would have easily been elected a third time. Remember, that's the example of Kennedy and Nixon. Nobody wanted that. Well, let's look at the changes then, though, that came through the 1950s. Remember, Ike will go on television to tell us about the beware the military industrial complex. But look what happened during his 2 terms of office. We went from 1,000 atomic weapons to 18,000. U.S. spending on defense increased at an unheard of rate. 700,000 troops are in bases around the world by 1960. That is a huge point, and it's something we need to realize. Really easy to say, beware this military industrial complex, but the reality is he couldn't control it either, right? Now, Kennedy's taking office, and one of the first things that happens is they will let him know that there is this operation planned for Cuba. And of course, as a cold warrior par excellence, wanting to prove his standing with that, he's very interested in that. But now we're not involved, right? I mean, we'll support them, we'll train them, we'll give them the weapons there, but we're not involved. Well, we're going to have some covering airstrikes. We're going to have some. No, 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 no. No, we don't do that. This is America. We just, and of course, the CIA guys are going, what? Wait, how's that work? Huge change. But what happens, of course, is they no, you're right, Mr. President. We can make that work. That'll work. It's okay. Now they're only bringing in 1,400 guys. Remember, Kennedy doesn't have time just to focus on this. He's got lots of other stuff. He's already created the Peace Corps, and these freedom riders are going around, and of course, you've got these sit-ins at these lunch counters. We've got all these protesters being jailed. We've got guys firebombing these buses. My gosh, there's so much going on. But they repeatedly assure Kennedy, and he comes back and says, well, what happens, if they don't, because what do they tell Kennedy? They tell him, of course, they'll be greeted as liberators. The people want to get rid of this Castro guy. They'll come and they'll embrace them, and they'll sweep the country as they come over to their side. Well, that isn't quite how it's going to work, as it never does. But Kennedy has said, we're not going to do all this. But what really happens, of course, is the CIA guys continue on as they planned. He's okayed the mission to land the exiles, but from the very beginning, it goes bad because they don't have the original invasion plan of 2 airstrikes against Cuban Air Force bases. So now you've got the Air Force teeing off on the supply ship. You've got a 1,400-man invasion force. And of course, Kennedy's been told, what happens if these guys can't do it? The original plan said, oh, it doesn't matter. Just like Castro, who spent all his time in those hillsides where nobody could find him, that's what these guys will do. They'll fade into the mountains and everything will be fine. Except, of course, there was a long distance before you could get to the mountains and a huge swamp. Oh, by the way, I told you that they had changed the Bay of Pigs in the time since anybody had been there to look at it. They'd changed that to a playground. So there's lots of good roads getting there. So the APCs and all the the Cubans can get there first. So, the point is, this thing goes badly. And in doing so, it has a huge impact. It has a huge impact in the world because, we can kind of tell our fingerprints are on this. And with that, more importantly, it has huge impact on Kennedy because he realized his own people will lie to him. They'll tell him what he wants to hear to get what they want. They fully assume they would back him into a corner and, sir, this is going to fail unless you authorize the airstrikes, unless you bring in our troops. The whole thing was never planned as what they said it was. It had been planned to be an excuse. Oh my gosh, there's fighting. We have to go down and rescue those good people of Cuba who are trying to throw Castro out. Kennedy wouldn't have any of it. Kennedy instead goes on television, claims responsibility. He's had a talk with Eisenhower, who chastises him, but Ike being Ike, as I said, foreign, political differences stop at the shoreline. Ike supports Kennedy. Kennedy accepts the blame, but he is angry, mortified, and will get rid of Alan Dulles, who had been the guy at the CIA for Ike, who had planned so many of these things, and says, "You're out of here." He does it secretly, does it 6 months later, but it's quiet, makes it look like it isn't because of that, but it clearly is. But there's a density of flashpoints with the Soviet Union, the Cold War, all these things we remember, the Berlin Wall suddenly being built. We've got those other pieces. Why do they build the wall? Because people are making their way to Berlin and can catch a plane out to freedom. And the people who can do that, they're the smart ones. They're the ones with some money. They're the ones that have some skills and abilities. The brain drain is killing Russia and the Soviet Union. They're losing their best people. And they've threatened, they've bullied, they've done everything. Kennedy will not do anything. The West will do nothing to stop their ability to do it. And suddenly, early one morning, I keep thinking it's a Sunday morning, that they move in with the trucks and they start building this wall, and people realize what's happening. And we remember vividly in our minds, we remember all of the videos of people trying to race across the wall, trying to get away from the guards to get across that place where they're building it. They get hung up on the barbed wire, they get stopped, they get everything. It's horrific to watch, but we of course see it as a perfect example of, that's why our system is so much better than theirs. And as Kennedy would say, we don't have to build walls to keep our people in. Kennedy, of course, by this time has settled on his point and his way to distract from the Bay of Pigs, which was to find a place we could compete with the Soviets, and that place was going to be space. And of course, it was vital that we do so because controlling the skies was going to mean so much. Remember, we had just we were getting our own satellites up in 1960. But remember all those early rocket launches we saw when we were young, where they'd just start to lift off and then crash back to the ground. So this was no small deal. And it's the deal that America came behind when Kennedy said, we can land a man on the moon before the end of the decade. We hadn't even managed to put a man in space at the time he said that, where the Russians and the Soviets already had. Not just dogs, not just pets, not just items. They had actually gotten into space with people and had orbited the Earth with them. We were well behind. And John Glenn, of course, is the first to orbit the Earth for America. And of course, the one I'm sure we all remember, and ironically, it was on this day in 1962 when Kennedy was informed by his national security advisor that there's conclusive evidence that a Soviet missile base is under construction in Cuba, only 90 miles from the coast of Florida. Why does that matter? Because, of course, our entire concept has been, even if they have the rockets, even if they launch, we have 20 minutes, 25, but 20 most likely by the time we realize they've truly launched them. We can get our own launched. We have mutually assured that our strike back will damage them beyond repair. So for them to do it to us would be unthinkable. But now, all of a sudden, if they're in Cuba, they are 5 minutes from hitting Washington. We might not even realize in time to get down the hallway to a a bomb shelter, a nuclear fallout shelter. And Kennedy then will hold meetings with his troops. They keep this away from the American public because they want to know what they're going to do. And this is where all of those things with the Bay of Pigs pays off, because Kennedy has realized that if he's in the room, he will be told what he wants to hear, not what's real. And thus he will end up putting his brother Bobby in the room as a stalking horse, saying, "This is what I think, this is what I want." And people will feel free to attack Bobby. He's just the attorney general. What do they care? And he will get a true airing of their beliefs, and they will work through this. We have all the transcripts, again, the things we did not know. We have all the background pieces. It is fascinating and frightening to read. Kennedy, 6 days later, goes on television, surprising the rest of the country. "It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union." They had thought that they could get it done. They had thought they could get it all put in place. Now, again, the things we didn't know, the Soviets had been griping about the fact that, of course, we've got missiles surrounding them far closer than 90 miles from their border, and they can't stand it. And this is going to be a power play. And of course, Castro, you know, um, has truly said, "They're going to come and get me. I need these weapons. They're going to finally get rid of me. They've been trying to get me out. This is the way." It's Castro's pushing that kind of leads directly to the Cuban Missile Crisis. And of course, Cuba is their effort to make what we made West Berlin and Western Germany into, that showcase where everything's great compared to how it looks in Moscow, where you have a controlled economy and don't necessarily have all the things you need or all the goods you'd like to have. Castro is pushed and it has gone. Now, the point is that with all that, with this Cuban Missile Crisis, we face the biggest crisis of our time. And I'm sure most of you out there are old enough to have your own memories of those days, because once it became known, the clock was ticking, because that clock was, how soon would it be before those missiles were fully operational? Now, remember, we have to go by what we see in those pictures taken again by U-2 planes. And it is our belief that they have not been made operational. We have a little time to choose whether we knock them out or try to negotiate them out. And of course, the point being that Castro just wants them operational. He doesn't, these are not poker chips to him. These are his defense. And what will happen, of course, we will see it all play out on our television, and we will see how people in Florida clear the grocery shelves of everything. I have distinct memories of the news programs where there's a single can rolling down an otherwise empty set of shelves, how people are responding to all this. And yet Kennedy is on the air, cool as a cucumber, and definitely in charge. And we're seeing that over and over again. What we don't know, he's also working a back channel concept and pulling it off, and with that, in the end, of course, although his military wants a military strike, his intelligence services are saying, "This is the time, take them out." All of these groups are saying, "Go in, surprise attack, wipe them out." And of course, his argument, expressed through Bobby, that just outrages many of these cold warriors is, "My brother will not become the Tojo of his generation. He will not stage a Pearl Harbor surprise attack in his own, in the Caribbean. And that just absolutely flabbergasts these hard-edged cold warriors. In the end, it will actually end up with a couple of them, Walker, leaving the service because he and Kennedy cannot get along. Walker in charge of the Air Force. I think on might have been Joint Chiefs of Staff. I can't remember. Point is, it's a victory, and you saw that line. We heard it a lot. We were eyeball to eyeball, and the other guy just blinked. Well, again, what we know behind the scenes, it is true. And Castro did go along with it, but through back channels in an indirect and cannot be linked as a quid pro quo, it said, but we know you'd been griping about those missiles we have in Turkey. Sometime down the road, we will replace them. They will just go away. It cannot be linked. You cannot let that out, but that's what we will do that. But we are not backing down on anything. And it's celebrated around the world as a great American victory, which, part of the problem is Khrushchev had found himself backed into a corner. And his group at the Kremlin are pushing him for hardline. This is the time. This is the attack. But the rest of them, of course, are just outraged that not only did they expend this time, did they make this effort, but that it failed, that it's seen as a worldwide failure. And this is where, despite all the rest of it, while Khrushchev will be around for a while, his days are numbered. He's really heading out at this point. And of course, the fact that we're celebrating just makes it that much worse. As it would be said years later, we were eyeball to eyeball and nobody blinked. It was not a good time. This was not a preordained end. And there are a lot of people, and among them, Khrushchev and Kennedy, who realized things have to change. And it is from this event that the two of them realized just how close it was and realized there was no way to have direct communications. It all had to go through intermediaries. Thus, the hotline is born. And at the same time, it brings awareness of what would have happened had there even been a limited nuclear exchange. How many people would have died in that? How many would die from the radiation? These weapons are so much larger than what we saw in Hiroshima. And Kennedy, realizing that, is informed by his advisors. Well, yeah, that fallout, all of that stuff when that you see going up in that cloud, that's irradiated dirt and dust. And he goes, well, what happens to that? Does it drift off to space? No, it sooner or later the winds die down and it drifts back to Earth. And of course, it's irradiated. It's coming back. The dust motes are in the clouds. It'll come back in rain. And Kennedy then starts pushing for getting rid of atmospheric testing of nuclear weapons when he's realizing that maybe, and nobody puts this together, but of course now, years later, we know all those nuclear tests we were doing over and over again in the West and Southwest, all that is drifting east, and thus all the higher rates of cancer, of leukemia, of all the rest. These are the things that actually, the positives that will come out of this. We experienced brinkmanship. We looked death in the face, but we had leaders that said, we've got to make improvements. We've got to make changes. Unfortunately, they had weakened Khrushchev, and he's not going to be around to do that with them. The problem is, as well, though, Kennedy is getting pushed. This entire concept, they want him to go into Laos and have been trying to get him in there for ages. We need to go save them. And he's going, why do we need to be in Laos? How would you even get to them? And then there's that question of South Vietnam. Remember, when it was partitioned, there would be the idea of free elections and whoever won would take it over. But in 56, Ho Chi Minh won. And that meant they would have been communist. So we just kind of ignored that answer. And what had actually happened is throughout the entire 1950s, we underwrote the entire expenses of France so that they would keep fighting the communists in Vietnam. Now, of course, by 56, they have tried to get our attention, and they had said they tried one last effort and got trapped. And they turned to Ike and had said, use the nuke. It's our only chance. Come in and nuke these hillsides so we can get our men out of there. And Ike says, absolutely not. We are not going to be the only country to use the atomic bomb, not once, but twice on questionable targets and against the same race, the Occidental race, or excuse me, the Asian race. He said, we're not doing that. And again, the reason why it was so important that what Truman had done, to take that off the table. Kennedy will have his finest hour. He will go to Berlin. He will make his famous Ich ein Berliner, his speech, where people are wildly happy with, having this successful young American there. Of course, the problem is that, 1963, Sioux City Journal is going to note the death of a helicopter pilot, an American helicopter pilot in South Vietnam. It started. We have put troops in there. Kennedy will not put ground troops, but he's put advisors. He's put people in to try to help South Vietnam. And yet, even by 62 and 63, he's having his doubts. We will end up backing a coup that will overthrow the person we had put in place, DM, and the people who run the coup will kill DM and his brother, who were the leaders of the country. And that affects Kennedy profoundly. And we have all of these records because Kennedy sits down and records his thoughts on this and the mistakes he'd made, because he'd allowed himself to get pulled into that concept, not realizing it wasn't his top advisors that wanted this. It was a breakaway group. He had gone along with them and shouldn't have put out all his feelings on it. But nothing will. He's talked to Walter Cronkite on TV and said, this war, you're asking where this should go. We're not really involved. We're helping, we're supporting, we're supportive, but in the end, it's their war. And he's been debating. In fact, he's announced he's going to take 1,000 men out of Vietnam. But he's got a plane trip to Dallas to help. We've got the election coming up next year, and there's problems in Texas. We're just going to go down to Texas briefly, and then when we get back, we'll take care of all these things. And of course, we don't. And of course, he's shot by somebody who had tried to immigrate to Russia. He's shot by somebody who had shown up at the Soviet Union embassy. There are questions. He's also, though, a former Marine, right? Which is where he learned how to shoot, how he got his marksmanship badge. So, with all of that, we've got great changes. And again, we have a change in personnel. And here's a guy who this time, his expertise, of course, is domestic affairs. That's all he's ever been interested in. And he comes to the office and says, in our time, we've come to live with times of great crisis. But this was the first nation in the world that was created with a purpose. All men are created equal. These are not just clever phrases. They are the promise to our citizens. He believes that. But by the same token, he does exactly what Truman did. He keeps all of his predecessors advisors, and of course he needs them because he's not the foreign policy expert. And yet, within a year after his great election, where they've painted Goldwater as a warmonger, within a year because of his experience of what happened in to America when we lost China. We have Marines going ashore in Vietnam. We have true, no longer advisors. We have people who are going to be fighting. Truth is, we'd already had people there fighting because the advisors wanted to go out in the field. You know, Canada Johnson had ordered troops in, and Westmoreland will be the charge. These are the things that happen to us when we believe wholeheartedly in that concept of that Cold War, not just as a competition, but a vital competition, not just as we want to have the ascendant position. It's we must have that position or we will be wiped off the face of the earth. Is that really the case? That's the question. And those are the questions we have to ask when we say, what did it mean to us, the people, to embrace this Cold War? Because as we've seen back in the 40s, it starts at this level. By the 50s, it's moved to this, and now the 60s, it has escalated, you know. And while we're successful in battle in Vietnam, we suddenly have gotten into another hot war, haven't we? All to avoid what Johnson had experienced when China fell, to avoid that attack, to avoid that debilitating loss that happened after McCarthy and everybody else rose up saying that, oh, this is the party of communists. So the Vietnam timeline, we're all familiar with it, but I want you to think about this. It reaches even farther into our lives, not just the people that go there, not just the families that have to wait to hear. We have to remember Vietnam will peak at 541,000 men in country, troops in country, in August of 1968. That's a lot of people. Almost 500,000 troops are in there by the end of 67. And we say that the North's been stopped. Yet then all of a sudden we have the Tet Offensive. Why am I talking about these? This is about a Cold War. These are the events. These are the events that are pushed forward by that fight for the Cold War. And remember, again, things don't stop on the domestic side. And we are told over and over again that there are communists back behind this as well. You cannot trust these people. These, of course, this is the beginning of the Black Panthers. Their fight is not against anybody in a war. Their fight is that they're getting hassled on the street. They're getting, and they're saying, we're going to start carrying guns. It's our right. Of course, Reagan, who is governor of California, says, no, we can't have that. But anti-war protests are growing and growing and growing. And right here, as 1968 is beginning, North Korea suddenly steps back up and hijacks a U.S. ship. The things we find out later, well, we find out, of course, it was a spy ship. And of course, it was supposed to do a whole lot of things, much like Gary Powers was supposed to do in that U-2 plane, but they don't, and they're captured and they'll be held. And our choice is, do we suddenly expand? We've got 500,000 guys in Vietnam. Do we suddenly expand and have another war with Korea? We're trying to figure out why they would do this. And of course, part of that is what we find out later, believed that that ship might possibly have intercepted the radio signals that would have been talking about the upcoming Tet Offensive. The Pueblo incident would have a major impact on Sioux City. LBJ is going to activate the Air Guard units in response from Sioux City, and they and the 185th are going to war. They're going to deploy to South Korea. At the same time, Westmoreland has, intelligence that says there's going to be an attack on one of the forward bases that has the long range artillery. He's preparing for it. He's been wanting to have the major battle, just like the French had. We want to have that major battle. And it's going to be at Quezon, where 6,000 Marines will get surrounded by 20 to 30, maybe more, thousand North Viet Cong. And that's going to happen on January 21st, the same time as that ship is being hijacked. And the siege will begin, and it will dominate our interests. 30 to 40,000 Viet Cong surrounding 6,000 men in the remote areas of northwest corner of South Vietnam. And of course, it's the Berlin airlift all over again. That's the only way these guys can be supplied. But the difference is, you're at war. They're not afraid to shoot down those airplanes, and they have the ability to do it. As I said, Westmoreland knew it was coming, and he pulled troops from the cities to deal with the attacks on these border areas. His intelligence had told him that. What his intelligence didn't say is that might have been part of the plan so that all of these attacks in the cities with the Tet Offensive could happen and do happen. And of course, that again has a major impact. The Iowa National Guard will get called up now. Something that they had avoided, keep the National Guard out of Vietnam, because in that case, you're not bringing draft age young men. You are bringing adults. You are bringing people with families. You are bringing fathers away from their family. And the second mech will mobilize and move out. And of course, that's going to include people from all over Northwest Iowa. So, and in doing so, it adds extra pressure. And it's an election year. And this guy will actually get the nod, promising to bring us together. And he's the original anti-communist. Again, he built, why are we talking about this? It is due to the Cold War that we even know who Richard Nixon is. We know that he has been nominated on a National Party ticket more times than anybody other than FDR. He lost a heartbreaker to JFK in 1960, and he's really, really smart. But what we didn't know, and didn't know until later, he's also damn bitter about that loss. Think of this timeline. We have an inauguration speech in January, and by March, we are in secret Cambodia bombings. We're widening the war. And at that same time, we're seeing the loss of all the people who were the only ones that had any kind of authority with him. Mainly Ike, who he revered and disliked at the same time, and Ike, who had come to treat him well, but initially had not wanted anything to do with him. But he orders FBI wiretaps to find leaks on this Cambodia operation. How could people have known about it? His person, perfect example of that Cold War concept. Look at this. It's the secretaries of state who are supposed to be bringing their crews and entire departments so that we have continuity in the concept of our foreign affairs. But Nixon will make Henry Kissinger his national security advisor. Remember that NSA 68 change that Truman had pushed forward that came about in 1950, where we've got this group worried about national security, i.e., the Cold War answers. And Henry Kissinger will have Nixon's ear. It's Henry Kissinger and Nixon who are deciding foreign policy. His State Department is really out of the loop of anything important. We have the Cold War taking control. At the same time, with those leaks about clandestine operations occurring, they go ahead and put together a group populated by former CIA operatives. Where did E. Howard Hunt come from? He's one of those CIA operatives that were training those guys for the Bay of Pigs operation and assured them, don't worry about it. The Americans will be right behind you. They'll come in after you. What we are seeing is the politicalization of the CIA. As we go back and look at all the papers afterwards, Nixon had also declared war on the protesters. This is all due to Cold War pressures. Everything is evaluated through the lens of how are we doing on the Cold War? What do we look like to the outside world? Nobody's saying, what does this look like in a free society? He authorizes that group that E. Howard Hunt helps put together. They call themselves the plumbers because they're to block the leaks. And what they're really doing is executing clandestine tactics on American soil on American citizens, clearly illegal, far outside any legal method. And he begins to use the CIA to deflect the FBI from figuring anything out. Now, he's already unlawfully invaded Laos. He's destabilized Cambodia because none of this is public. He needs money to support these internal operations, so he's trading political favors for dollars. He hires these plumbers and needs money for that, for breaking and entering jobs. In fact, one of the things that will unravel Watergate is the fact that E. Howard Hunt's wife, and Hunt is sitting in prison, I think, at this point because of the Watergate item. E. Howard Hunt's wife dies in a plane crash in Chicago. But what is amazing is she has $100,000 in a suitcase in cash. And it's all traced back to money that had been given as a donation. What will come out of this when they're wiretapping everybody and setting up dirty tricks? All of this is stuff that grows out of that unbridled competition, that concept that one side is evil because we represent the good in this massively important Cold War. By the way, you realize that the Watergate bugging that got busted for is the second one because they'd already successfully bugged it once, but they weren't getting the information they wanted, so they wanted to move it. If they hadn't done that, we probably never would have caught him, wouldn't know about half of this, and it would have continued. As I said, he's paying off those plumbers with cash, and most of that cash is campaign money that's been gotten by basically selling ambassadorships to big money people. But as he tries to escalate the war, and all of this is revealed, this being the escalation of the war and the bombings into Laos and Cambodia, we have the events at Kent State. And of course, the entire country, the entire educational system shuts down higher education. Protests have escalated, schools are closed, Congress attempts finally to undercut the authorization for the war given through Gulf of Tonkin. They fail, but Nixon realizes it's now impossible for him to escalate the war any farther. His idea of his secret plan, which was essentially just more people, he now talks about withdrawals in earnest. But he's covering all this because he's playing the Chinese against the Russians, because as the original Cold Warrior, he's the only one who could dare talk to both of these sides and try to make nice to them without having been charged as being a dupe or a communist spy. Through all of this, we see as well the issues that are coming to us now from those different groups that, we had helped destabilize their efforts to have a popular government. And now, of course, Iran is in trouble. Now, of course, we've got the issues with the Arab-Israeli war. Now, of course, we've got things happening in South America. We've got worries everywhere because we're attacking anybody that we think might have anything to do with any communist because we see them as one unified group. But the thing is, they tried to put together the Pentagon Papers. On his way out, McNamara had said, you need to preserve all the papers. We need to someday be able to look back and see what went wrong and how. And Nixon is paranoid about this because Nixon, of course, has one piece in there. Johnson was trying very hard in 68 to get a peace agreement to get us out of Vietnam. Nixon was the one who said, no, I have a secret plan. And of course, his problem is through his people, he'd sent notice to the South Vietnamese to not accept anything that the North is saying through Johnson because he'll get a better deal through Nixon. And of course, 5 years later and 20,000 American deaths later, he's forcing to accept the same offer. And of course, that concept of peace with honor, is the result. We are reaching I'd like to say the bottom point of the Cold War, but it really isn't. The aftermath is after we've spent $140 billion, we've had 2.7 million people served, we've got 58,000 deaths, with 300,000 injured. It will actually continue to give us trouble. We do, and I've mentioned these figures before, but I don't want them overlooked. Our part of the war is going to continue until 1973. 61% of the men who were killed in Vietnam were 21 years of age or younger. It lasted 16 years for time we had people involved from 59 to 75. State of West Virginia has the highest death rate. The national average, 58.9% of a death rate per 100,000 men. So, 25% of the United States will serve, the United States forces serving in Vietnam were draftees. It was 66% were draftees in World War II. And, these are big, big things. The average age of people serving during the Vietnam War was 19. The average age of a soldier in World War II was 26. 97% of Vietnam vets were honorably discharged. But speaking of that, think of what we also had found in 1969. It had happened in 68, but we didn't know it. That was the My Lai massacre. And what did we do about that? We knew about it. We heard about it. We did our best to cover it up. And when it did come out and somebody was held responsible, he ended up being pardoned in a limited method, but it did happen, didn't it? So, final number killed or missing in action, injured, and 3.4 million would serve during that time. Now, how does this tie to the Cold War? Directly, and we know that. But what comes after that is that we want to find out how some of these other things came to pass. We are trying to figure out what's going on with the basic problem that Truman had said could happen. Should America, which stands for openness and transparency, have a clandestine agency that engages in operations that have no oversight? Think about this. Starting in the late 1960s, the CIA would eavesdrop on Martin Luther King, Whitney Young, and other civil rights activists, Muhammad Ali, Tom Wicker, and Art Buchwald. Yet, at the same time, they would also eavesdrop and wiretap the two guys that are running the committee to try and figure out what's going on, and it's a joint committee, jointly run by a Democrat and a Republican. The related fact to all these people, every one of them in 67 had voiced an opinion about the war in Vietnam, and that opinion had disagreed with LBJ's policy. So, by the way, we didn't know any of this until 2013. When you speak about the long reach of the Cold War, Ford has battled back. Carter had just dominated the nomination process. Ford battles back to where he's almost even up. And he agrees to a debate. And the big thing that sinks his ship finally, because it is still very close, one of the biggest things that happens is he denies that the Soviets are controlling Poland, which Carter tries to let him out of. Carter says, well, I'm sure he misspoke. He just meant, and he says, no, because of course, in our policies, we treat the Warsaw Pact as independent countries. But again, it's that Cold War that is reaching through. And what's going to happen to much of Carter's presidency? He's got a guy running around the country campaigning against a treaty to say, we should honor the fact that we had said that we would give the canal back at a certain point, the Panama Canal. And he's got a guy running around, and notice who's with him, some guy named John Wayne. John Wayne, of course, is really frustrated, though, and writes him a letter telling his buddy, longtime buddy Reagan, off because he says, you're distorting the facts on this. You don't need to distort the facts, just tell the truth. The Senate will hold their nose and they will ratify that Panama Canal Treaty after a huge effort by Carter with his own party by one vote. And of course, what that's going to do is destabilize the Democrats. They will lose because it's not popular. Carter's approval rating drops, and yet he tries to get rid of the B-1 bomber. He defers production of the neutron bomb. He's trying to get away from so many of these Cold War issues. He visits the Shah of Iran on New Year's Eve of 1977, reiterating America's support and calling him an island of stability in a troubled region. And of course, that will come back when the Shah is overthrown. And not long after that, the embassy will be overrun and hostages are taken. All going back to 1953, when we'd already used our efforts to put the Shah back in place, something most people are not aware of. And America will be held hostage, and Carter's presidency will be held hostage throughout all that. Again, it's the problem with secret groups. We don't have insights and we don't have any oversight over them. Future presidents, including Reagan, will run into that same problem. And remember, the Cold War continues because in 1979, before Carter gets out of office, in December, the Soviet Union invades Afghanistan, who had been kind of a friendly ally after their leader in place is assassinated, and they're afraid it's going to fall away and fall to the non-communist countries. This will make it, the USSR's Vietnam, but it's backed by the CIA, and anti-Soviet forces will eventually push the USSR out of that country. It'll destabilize and demoralize the Soviet Union. But in the process as well, the high tensions that are in place will mean that mistakes will be made on other fronts in that Cold War. The Soviets will shoot down an airliner. Sadly enough, some 4 or 5 years later, America will do something very similar, with an airliner. But those are the mistakes that happen when you make this such a big point. Now, of course, the Reagan doctrine is directly about anti-communism. He doesn't like Nixon, he's been an anti-communist for a long, long time. And he expands the military, he adds money to covert operations, and will take those things up and puts a CIA director in place that will do whatever it is they decide to do. Reagan is pushing the agency. Reagan wants other hostages rescued. He also wants to make Nicaragua, which appears to be possibly falling, although they're doing it through popular elections, to a possible communist. And that's going to lead us also to Grenada. But eventually it's going to lead us to the Iran-Contra affair, in which one of his national security agents goes rogue, or at least that's as far as we can tell. And again, if you don't have oversight, how do you control any of this? Again, all of this is the issue where the Cold War itself has become more important than what perhaps we stand for. Because the problem with true believers, nothing is off limits. And what will happen is, Ollie North will decide he has intelligence on the inside, in Iran, and they can get to these hostages if we just do this or that. And of course, the CIA laughs it off. They know the source and know that he's, totally illegitimate. But they need the CIA to make it work, and they get the help because Reagan's pushing for it, and they will provide planes to get the missiles that could reach to the Middle East, and the money and the weapons that will come back from that will be shipped on the other side to the Nicaraguan rebels to prevent that communist takeover, even though Congress has said off limits, can't do it. Don't give them any money. Oh, we're not giving them any money. Iran is giving them the money, right? At the same time, though, Reagan is pushing hard, and it's Gorbachev that is now the fourth leader in less than a year who will take over at the Soviet Union. And Gorbachev is a very different person. Reagan and Gorbachev meet in Iceland, and they nearly agree to give away all the nukes. Unfortunately, if they did that, we, of course, would be outnumbered in troops. They had to work hard to get Reagan out of there before they made that agreement. Reagan would say to Gorbachev, the United States and the Soviet Union are the two greatest countries on earth, the superpowers. They're the only ones who can start World War III, but they're also the only two countries that could bring peace to the world. And you know what? They'll do so. Of course, this Iran-Contra thing gets in the way because a plane heading for Nicaragua crashes, and it's full of money, arms, and stuff for the deal. And the CIA wants out of it because they know they're the ones that'll get burned. So, with all of that, we see the issues. And the biggest issue being that when they look into it, yes, we all agree the president had no prior knowledge of the action for Iran-Contra. But if the president did not know what his national security advisors were doing, he should have. The irony, of course, is that Oliver North, who had been given immunity, basically says, I did all of it. And he will end up, they will get 11 convictions. North, who ends up getting convicted on other items, would later have all those convictions overturned. And the irony to that is, of course, it's the ACLU who comes to his rescue, a very liberal organization, saying, really, you're the guys who gave him this immunity. Now, Reagan's popularity has the biggest decline ever. But, he is also on his way out the door after 2 terms. He'll be replaced by a guy who had actually been a former head of the CIA. So we know we will see more adventuring that way. But through a lot of the efforts of these people, the one thing that no one ever thought would happen is the wall will come down. And of course, one of the biggest people behind that is Gorbachev, because remember what I said, as long as you're going to send in the tanks against your own people, you can maintain control. And Gorbachev was not willing to do that. And of course, one of the problems is all of those things with Afghanistan, we would arm those rebels to take on, the Soviets, and it was successful. But then we will stay in Saudi Arabia and absolutely incense one of those same rebels, and that will lead us to 9/11. All of this is an outgrowth of that Cold War. And all of that is our failure to recognize that not every issue should be an us versus them issue. These are the problems of the concept of the Cold War. That leads to other issues. The Arab oil issues have its roots in the Arab-Israeli conflict. Latin American problems are income gaps, not Russian-inspired plots. But in the end, the Soviet Empire is dissolved. But I want you to consider this. Instead of a Marshall Plan to help those former states reconstruct themselves as functioning democracies in a capitalistic society, we gave nothing. Yet in 1990, our economy was 25 times larger than it had been in 1945. So back to my original question, what impact does the Cold War events of the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s have on today? I hope I have given some of those answers. I hope you can see how that thread runs throughout. What do we know now versus what we knew then? I've tried to tie some of those things together. That missile gap that Kennedy talked about that Ike knew didn't exist, but he couldn't say it because it was information that only he had. And he also knew that it would violate his agreement with the Soviets and possibly spark a greater arms race. We didn't know that we saw the Chinese and the Russians standing together. We saw all of these groups. If they were communists, they were all on the same side. We saw what our adventuring in Iran, in Guatemala, in Haiti, and think of Haiti, and in Vietnam had. All of those things are major things. This is the problem of when you start out with a true competition and we just want to see who's going to win this race, but we decide that the winner of the race lives and the loser of the race dies. We've added a different feeling to that. And I hope every one of you can see how the concept of that Civil War, that Cold War, has certainly permeated our lives through most of it. And how those things that we saw happening way up here that were life and death items, the concept of who has the bomb, who has, the military wherewithal, versus those concepts down at the bottom that my janitor might have once been a communist, so he should be released from his job. One of the people that worked for me had once belonged to a communist party. He shouldn't be here. And how all of the choices and all of the items, as we follow down those steps across the years, and our choices in saying, oh, it's more important to us to have a stable government than to have a free government. We might have paid the price for those choices. And that's one of the issues behind the Cold War. Next week, I'm going to be talking about what happens next, about the world we live in today, about how that Cold War is still kind of with us, isn't it? But maybe in a different method. And what does that mean for us today and where we can go from there? I've got to ask, is this the class you'd hoped it to be? Is this what you were hoping to hear about? Folks, you can unmute yourselves and talk. I hope this is something. um, there's a lot of research here, and I wanted to bring this forward because you don't find many of these things tied together, and I wanted to make sure that I did that as best I could for you. So, if there's anybody out there, I'd love to hear from you at this moment. I know we have hit our time limit, but I wanted to make sure that we covered as much of this so that we are in position next week to really look at today and what it means. Any thoughts, feedback, concepts? I'd love to hear from you. Okay. Well, it looks like some of you are unmuted. That's cool. You can certainly try to unmute. Sarah, how you doing?
I'm doing well. It's a little mind-boggling, all of this information that we're finding out now. It, I'll just say that it's just mind-boggling. It takes a while to process all this.
Yeah, I can see that. And I wanted to, make certain that you got this information. I didn't make this up. This comes from a lot of different places, but none of it, I'm not stretching the points in any place. Maybe you're going to connect the dots a little bit differently than I do. And of course, we've had to push some of these things. I am not diminishing at all what Reagan did, using the economic side to push for the end of the Cold War. The question is, we need to ask ourselves, did we do what we should have done to ensure, much like at the end of World War II, that we didn't have a repeat of World War I's ending, with a Great Depression and everything falling into two problems after that. Yes, we had more debt, at this point, but technically, again, did we have more debt in 1990? We had the entire debt of World War II, and we still had some debt, I think, left from World War One. Remember, the whole reason taxes were so high, which was one of the things that had moved Reagan from being a Democrat to a Republican, was taxes were too high. Why were they so high? We were paying off the debt from World War II. We intended to get back to a balanced budget, and we did. We don't believe that anymore. That's fine. I'm not saying whether that's good or bad. I'm just saying that's where the difference is. Could we have provided some sort of stimulus or something to try to pull those people together? And would it have worked? I don't know. We see the oligarchs that rose in all of those countries where they took control of the business, they built it up, they made themselves millionaires, and again, returning people almost to serfs in some of those countries. But of course, one of the things we're going to be looking at next week, all of these issues of where it goes after that. We're in some sort of competition with China, very much so right now, right? And of course, we have a different circumstance with Russia and with the Ukraine. We got a lot of things going on. Hopefully, history can help us at least provide some tools to analyze some of that and see what we can think, right? So that's where I'm going next week. I hope that's where you want to go. Okay. All right. It's late. If you want to talk, I'd love to hear from you. If you don't want to talk, I'm willing to let you go. I understand. So thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you.